Oh, so as I said, great to see everybody. Welcome back to Tanya. We took a little hiatus, some Israel trips, some holidays, but we are ready to roll again. So let's give a little recap of what we have done so far in the Tanya, and then we'll set the stage for today where we are heading to. So we started off Tanya chapter 1, starting off with a technical question. Well, let me back up a second. The Tanya in general is a book to help us serve God. Let's put it that way. It's a book to help us to know our purpose, to know how to serve God. We all know, of course, the Torah gives us Torah and mitzvos, but is that serving God? That's, the Tanya gives us the guidebook, how to serve God, which is ultimately our mission. So in chapter 1, we started discussing the righteous man, the wicked man, the intermediate man. These are all labels that are for technical questions, but are not necessarily that important to how you live your day-to-day life. And then we jumped into chapter 1. We discussed, labels can of course affect how people perceive themselves. But we jumped into chapter 1. We discussed the animal soul, and we discussed in chapter 2, following it, the godly soul. So again, we started to discuss that we have two souls. We have two competing drives within us: a animalistic soul that wants to enjoy life and chocolate cake, and a godly soul that wants to enjoy God. We spent in chapter 2 a lengthy explanation of how everybody does have a godly soul, despite the differences between people. And then in chapter 3, we started to discuss our more inner capabilities, our intellect. So again, chapter 3 was more about our intellect. And we also then jumped into our emotions. So again, if you want to say the soul is made up of 10 powers, in other words, we're getting into the makeup of the soul. Why is it important to discuss the makeup of the soul? Because if we understand how the soul works, we can understand how to use it. What parts of the soul are easier to control, what parts of the soul are harder to control. So again, we discussed the soul is made up of 10 parts. 3 of them are intellectual: chachma, bina, dat, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Then we discussed the 7 emotions, which are generally split up into love and fear. Finally, we started chapter 4, in which we started discussing the 3 garments of the soul. In the last class that we gave, we had a lengthy discussion about the garments, how it's important to discuss the garments. We discussed the garments are thought, speech, and action. We discussed why they're called garments, because garments are things that you can change. You can change your thoughts at any given time, redirect. You can change your speech. Most definitely, you can change your actions. So although they're not the essence of the soul, they are the way your soul interacts with the world. And with that, we explained that this will lead to a foundational idea of the Tanya, and that is that even though you cannot necessarily control your inner self, right? We all know we have issues, and we know we can go to therapy for 1,000 years, but we do have more control over our actions. We have more control over our speech, and we have some control over our thoughts. Good afternoon. Bruce is right out there. Okay, awesome. And so that was the discussion last time. So again, if we go with the Tanya, we first started off saying we have 2 souls. Then we broke down the soul, specifically so far the godly soul, is having 10 powers: 3 intellectual, 7 emotional. Then we discussed there's another layer on top of the soul called the garments. Will be on page 64. The garments of thought, speech, and action. The garments are not necessarily really a part of the soul. They are the way the soul interacts and expresses itself, whether by thought, whether by speech, or whether by action. And again, last time's discussion was about how beautiful it is that, good afternoon, how beautiful it is that we have the ability to control you could pick any of the chairs. Azami may have made some mess in that one. I mean, it's white, so it shows everything. have kids, they said it'll be fun, right?
I don't know anymore.
No, you're not sure. Okay.
I don't remember.
You don't remember. Okay. Well, you still have kids and they're still fun, right?
They are.
Yes.
They're more fun now.
They're more fun now. Okay. In a different way.
Yeah.
So, so we have, our kids are not like our garments, right? So the garments of the soul, we can interchange anytime, can swap them out. Children are more like the faculties of our soul, which you can never switch. You always have them. Anyways, so that is a discussion of the garments. We're going to be on page 64, but as usual, we are going to jump into a discussion here, because that was pretty much our discussion last time. We just set the stage because, again, the terminology of the Tanya sometimes sounds weird to us, like who talks about their thought, speech, and action as being garments, right? It's not a typical way of speaking, manner of speech.
Right.
But so last time we really spent a lot of time describing why our thought, speech, and action are called garments. Just as garments can be swapped out, so too your thought, speech, and action can be swapped out. Thought was the hardest one to grasp, but they can all be swapped out. This week, we're going to break down a little bit more how the godly soul uses the thought, speech, and action. So again, last week we went to the general idea that the soul can express itself through the garments. This week, we're going to describe in more detail what that actually looks like. So let me make sure I'm on the right page over here. Okay. All right, so now we're going to discuss in detail how the godly soul actually uses the these garments to connect with God. Okay. So what would you imagine would be a godly thought? Well, let's put it this way. If the godly soul is in charge of your garment of thought, what would that look like? What do you think? And if you're on Zoom, you can also pipe in, or if you want to put in the chat. So again, now we're getting into the detail. How does the godly soul actually use your garments? By the way, this is an important discussion, because if we want to evaluate ourselves, which soul am I following at this given moment, you have to evaluate. Well, are the garments that I'm using right now, the thought, speech, and action, are they godly or are they animal? Because there's no in between. It's either one or the other. That's really why it's so important. It's one or the other. And so if you know it's not godly, then you know it's the other one.
I'm thinking that it expresses itself through emotion, and then through emotion you have a thought.
Yes, it's correct, but emotion.
It's not you.
Emotion. Well, we'll get to soon, but emotion is more you than the thought is. Just a simple example. You can feel one thing. We spoke about this last time. You can feel one thing and think something else, right?
Right.
This is what they tell people. If you're suffering with terrible feelings towards something, they think something else in your mind to distract yourself. That shows you that your thoughts are not as internal as your soul, because you can think something that's totally not what you're feeling, right? So you're going on a roller coaster, you feel really scared. You tell in your mind, I'm not scared, or whatever psychology says to think about. Thoughts can help redirect our feelings. Doesn't happen right away though. It was just I'm on some parenting group that she was talking about, if you're feeling stressed, whatever, just change your thought patterns. It's going to help you feel differently.
Right.
So again, that shows you that our feelings are more internal than our thoughts, because you cannot just tell yourself feel differently. That doesn't work, right? Anybody who says just feel differently, that definitely doesn't work. You can attempt to do things that will help redirect your feelings, like think differently, speak differently, act differently, but there's no promise. There's no promise of that it'll work. But the fact that you can think against your feelings shows that your thoughts are not as intrinsic to your soul as your feelings are. So that being said, what would a godly thought be, or a godly soul thought? Not a godly thought. If your godly soul was thinking, what would it look like?
It's always a question for me, like, does this serve God?
Right. So I'm just looking for an example. You don't have to have,
that's it.
You don't have to have all the right answers. Just one example.
Go to synagogue Saturday.
So you're thinking, let me go to synagogue.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you're thinking about doing a positive action. Yeah. Yes. Anybody else? We have everybody on Zoom is pretty quiet.
put on fill in.
Yeah, so now, so okay, so it's one form of thought, thinking about the things that I should be doing. Okay, so thinking and planning how to get to do something positive. Any other thoughts? You can think Torah study, of course, is another way. You can have just another example, by the way, you can be using the garment of action for your godly soul and using your garment of thought for your animal soul, both at the same time, right? You can be praying and thinking about who knows what, right?
Yeah.
You can be eating matzah and thinking about whatever, so you can be using both for different souls at the same time, which is quite fascinating. So, okay, a godly action, of course, we know any positive actions pretty much. Okay, mitzvahs are easy. The Tanya will break it down further. What goes in the category of godly, what doesn't. But we're going to go with the easy ones for now. And of course, speech, saying words of Torah, reading the Haggadah, the rabbis telling jokes, all those things can be classified as mitzvahs.
Clearly the latter is using the animal soul.
Yeah, that's using the animal soul. Okay. So simply put, anytime you're doing a mitzvah or leading towards a mitzvah with your thought, speech, or action, at that time, most definitely your thought, speech, or action are being employed by your godly soul. Okay. We spoke about, sorry, okay. So let's talk for a moment about something which actually has to do with feelings. Why are we going to talk about feelings? Because feelings drive your garments, as you mentioned a moment ago, right? So the Tanya, although we're discussing in this chapter 4, garments, which are thought, speech, and action, we're going to discuss feelings. Why do we discuss feelings? Because feelings drive the action. And what we're going to discuss is that the action, so the feelings, when you do a mitzvah, it's both necessary to have love of God and awe of God. Okay? Understand? So when we serve God, we need to have both love and awe. So again, you could serve God just by action. But as I just described a moment ago, we want to employ every element of our being, right? We don't want to be doing a mitzvah and having, random thoughts. So the Tanya describes that the feelings of love and awe in a mitzvah are like wings of a bird. Okay? They're wings of a bird. They help create, you know what? Maybe I'm talking too much. Let's read inside and then I'm going to explain it. That actually sounds better. So let's take a look here. Let's refresh. And we'll actually start from the beginning of last week just to give us a fresher. From the top of the page. I'm not going to go all the way to the explanation, but from the top of the page. Okay. So let me share my screen. So we get back into this. Okay, share. I'm wondering if the microphone is not working because we haven't heard anybody on the on the Zoom so far. But okay. So let's go. So we'll start from here. Okay, this is on page 64 at the top. So it says like this. Furthermore, every divine soul possesses 3 garments. As the Tanya previously explained, you possess 2 souls, an animal soul with a self-oriented and a divine soul which desires to follow God. God's will was revealed to mankind at Sinai through the 613 commandments of the Torah. So it follows that the garments of the soul are every thought, spoken word, or deed devoted to the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah, right? If you're a godly soul, you want to connect to God, your garments will be connecting to God. The most fully awakened state of consciousness is when all your garments are devoted to God and not yourself. This is when you practically observe all action-related mitzvahs and you use your speech to discuss the 613 mitzvahs and their laws, and you immerse your thought in whatever you can grasp in Torah texts, which are analyzed through the 4 different methods: pshat, literal, remez, allegorical, drush, homiletical, sod, mystical. Then your whole divine soul, including all her 613 components, is dressed through her garments of action, speech, and thought in the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. Your soul and the mitzvahs are deeply compatible. corresponding precisely to the 650 mitzvahs, are 650 components of your soul, which are fully engaged in observing the mitzvahs. So that was just a recap. I'm sorry I read that fast, but that was a recap. So that was a describing a immersion. If your soul has thoughts towards God, has feelings towards God, does thought, speech, and action towards God, your soul is completely immersed and connected with God. Because that's what your soul wants. Remember, your soul is godly. Makes sense. It wants to connect to God, as godly. Now the Tanya will describe in more detail the total immersion of your soul via her garments into Torah. So he says like this: to be precise, your soul's chokhmah, which is wisdom, bina, which is understanding, and das, knowledge, are fully engaged through the garment. We'll go to the next page. Through the garment of thought in grasping the Torah that you study. So notice how he mentioned the intellectual powers of the soul using the garment of thought. Think about it like this, right? The powers of the soul do need the garment, right? Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge are expressed and processed through thought, right? Thought allows you to process the thoughts that are necessary to think about the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge of the Torah. So he continues, which exercising the full capacity of your intellectual and your soul's spiritual root, you master in Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod. Did we explain the somebody's writing about motivation here. We'll discuss motivation in a moment. Actually, it'll be part of this class. So good thing. Did we discuss last time the 4 levels of the Torah? Anybody remembers?
I don't remember.
Right. Okay. This is the second time he's throwing out the 4 levels of the Torah. So the Torah is split up generally to Peshat, which means the simple level of understanding any section of the Torah. Remez means things that are hinted to, like gematria, numerical values. Drush are like homiletical sermons, things like that, which are not necessarily literal. Medrash, think about it like that. And so does the mystical. If you came to the course Booksmart, you of course will have some knowledge on these 4 levels.
I do not think that we did.
Okay, but that was the last course, so we touched upon. We discussed too much of the remez, the hinting level. Anyways, so we are describing right now, the Tanya, if you notice, is describing the ideal moment of your soul's complete connection and enrapture with God, which is what it desires. So we're describing here what your soul wants to do, by the way. Your soul wants to be using its mind, all its intellectual powers, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, which we discussed in previous classes, along with a garment of thought in Torah study. And he's going to say, in this state, not only is your mind awakened, but your emotions too. He's going to say, if you're completely bound with God, you will be bound not only in your thought, but in your heart too. And he says, and the emotional powers of your soul, namely reverence and love, along with all their derivatives, are fully engaged in observing the Torah through her garments of action and speech. So notice how he described the powers of your thought, meaning your wisdom, understanding, and knowledge drive your garment of thought, whereas your powers of emotions are driving your speech and your action. Okay? So this is where we want to pause. We're going to pause over here. He's going to say that
Rabbi, can you say that again?
Your soul's your soul's power. Which part?
Your emotions drive.
Your emotions drive your speech and your action.
And what was before that?
Your faculties of intellect, which is knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. They drive and connect to God through thought. Again, there's 3 garments, right? Thought, speech, and action. The word garments we discussed before. So
and
your garment
is the only way to be fully engaged and connected to God through the mitzvot? Or can you do it washing dishes?
That's a discussion that we will continuously express in the next couple chapters.
Okay, great.
But right now, like I
can
said,
wait.
right now we're going with the easy part.
Okay.
Then we can get into later. Well, how do you classify as mitzvah? Is doing dishes a mitzvah? But we're right now discussing if you were to imagine a soul completely bound with God, you'd have all the 10 powers of the soul, intellect and emotional involved, and you'd have all of the garments involved, thought, speech, and action. So that's what we're describing here. We're describing a soul that is completely engaged at all levels. When you say firing in all pistons, this soul is firing in all pistons and connecting to God at all levels. Okay. Now it's interesting. He says, that your emotions, both love and fear, are the motivators and are driving your speech and your action. And he starts off with the first level of speech, referring to Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. The study of Torah is, of course, one form of a mitzvah which actually uses speech, and you could say action, because at least your mouth is moving, so there's action there as well. It's like when I go to the doctor, I say I exercise, I move my mouth when I eat. But to an extent, Torah study, when you say it, it has both speech and action involved because you're moving your lips. I'm going to read a little bit further inside, and then I'll go out to the explanation, because this is such an important topic in how we serve God. The idea of the motivation of love and fear, or love and awe, how that motivates your actions. So let's continue what he says. So he says, why is the practical observance of a mitzvah an expression of love? Right? The question is, I guess, since we've been discussing Tanya, you probably know the answer. For love is the motivator behind all 248 commandments of action. They all flow from love and have no true basis without it. Of the 630 commandments, 248 are positive commandments, actions, dues, and 365 are prohibitions, don'ts, to refrain from a certain action. While it is possible to observe the precepts out of habit for the sake of social acceptance or for some other ulterior motive, the 248 commandments of action can only be observed authentically if they are motivated by love. So again, he is saying, technically, can you do an action towards God without love? Yes, but they would only be due to external factors, not because you're motivated to do it, right? So let's say a child. I want to say the word serving, but you could say serving their parents, okay? Let's put it in that way. It can be motivated out of external factors. Let's say a child serving their elderly parents. We can use the word serving. It can be motivated external, how people perceive it and how society looks at it. But ideally, it's motivated by love. Ideally, it's motivated by love. It's the ideal.
Yeah,
right?
somebody asked about motivation.
You might imagine that your love of God would take its full expression as a purely emotional experience. But just as you would express your absolute love for another person with a physical embrace, the Kabbalah teaches that a person that truly loves God will also want to embrace him, so to speak. So this is an important line. Love, emotions should lead to action. Let's take a look at marriage, for example. I saw one, maybe it was in Rabbi Twersky's books. He was saying sometimes people confuse love for passion. And passion can be about yourself, and love is about the other person. So when someone loves their spouse, but never wants to do anything for them, they may not actually be loving them. They're loving themselves, and they may be experiencing passion or whatever. The actual words you use are not important. You get the idea. In other words, words today are used to describe many things. And so therefore, it's really hard to say, this is the definition of this word, that's the definition of that word. But true love, as we want to describe it, is care for another person. And therefore, there has to be an expression of action. And therefore, as we discussed in previous classes, even if you will be doing a mitzvah because you want the reward that comes with the mitzvah, that's not loving God either. That is loving yourself. So that's, again, doing it for an external reason. That would be akin to saying, you're going to take care of your parents when they're elderly because when you take care of them, they'll give you the inheritance. You're not loving them, right? You're loving the money, right? You're loving yourself ultimately, right? You're loving the inheritance. So if we were to serve God for the Garden of Eden that we get when we pass away, that would not be serving God. That would be serving ourselves again.
Yeah.
Right? We'll be serving ourselves. Which serving ourselves is not what the godly soul is about. The godly soul is godly, therefore wants to connect to its source, which is God. And it just loves God. It's a part of God, right? It's just innate love, like our children love us. It's very innate. Maybe as they get older. All right, let's take a look at a comment over here. Emotions should lead to action. It depends. Emotions should lead to action, question mark. It depends on the emotion. Heard a story, Rabbi Akiva was the only rabbi that explored all the levels of Torah. It's possible. He's one of the greatest sages of all time. He did explore all levels. There are other sages who explored all levels, maybe not at the same level. Emotions should lead to action. Okay. Depends on the emotion. Okay. All emotions lead to action. Some lead to actions of doing, and some lead to actions of refraining. So fear will cause you, the emotion of fear will cause you to refrain from doing certain things. So I'm afraid of fire. I will not jump into a home with fire. So it's a negative action, but it's an action nonetheless. That's in this context. In the context of mitzvahs, of course, it means you will refrain from doing a transgression, right? So again, the emotion is pushing that. Let's continue reading. And we're again, after we're going to read all this, we're going to discuss more as well. But yeah, keep the comments coming, keep the thoughts coming. Okay, so he says like this. Because the person who observes 248 action-related commands authentically is one who loves God's name. I don't know why I use the word God's name as a discussion for another time. And for your purposes, just think about God and desires to truly be attached to him. And it's impossible to truly attach yourself to God without observing the 248 commandments, which are the 248 organs of God, so to speak, as explained elsewhere. So this is saying that you should know that there is no way for you to connect to God without doing a mitzvah, right? So in other words, when I love my spouse, I love my child, I know what to do to make them feel loved. And what the Tanya here is telling you is, if you truly love God, that's what you claim, which a lot of people do, right? You meet a lot of spiritual people out there, they love God. How do you connect to God? God is infinite. God is well beyond us, right? How do you connect to him? I know that chocolate cake makes my child happy.
No.
If I put chocolate cake on an altar and give it to the Lord, will he like it? How am I to know? All right. The only way to know what God likes is if he tells us. He's infinite. He doesn't need anything from us. There's nothing even if I say, God, I love you so much, I'm going to jump up and down out of sincerity to you. God might say that's beautiful, but I actually told you what I like. Right? It's like, or think about it this way. Again, this is taking human examples. Your spouse has clearly told you they don't like, don't like chocolate, let's say. And you go out, you love chocolate, right? And you go out and you say, well, I know I love chocolate. I'm sure my spouse would love chocolate. You go out, you buy a whole bunch of chocolate. The gift will not be appreciated because yes, you came with a feeling of love. That may be true, but the execution of it has been really bad, right? Really bad. Or let's say you love your rabbi, so you buy him a dog. No, I'm kidding. You love dogs. So he said, let me buy the rabbi a dog. Well, the rabbi is not at a place where he'll appreciate dogs, in his house at this point in time. So with God, it's the same thing. We can love God so much that we do things that we think he'll like, but that's not really love. Love is Love is knowing and trying to get what the other person likes. Now, when you don't know what the other person likes and you do something sincere, it's appreciated, right? So let's say there's somebody I don't know very well. Let's say I was a guest in someone's house. I really appreciate them. I get them a gift. They know, right? You say it's the thought that counts, right? Right?
Yes.
It is the thought that counts, and it is appreciated in that case. However, if that host had told you what they like and what they don't like, and you went ahead and get them something else, then the thought that counts is not really a great thought, right?
Right.
So the same thing goes with God. If God has told us what he likes, it doesn't make a difference how sincere we are and how much we think God would love me doing X, Y, and Z. If it's not communicated to us, that's what he wants, and he has communicated to us what he likes, then you're not really expressing love. I don't know what it is. It may be an expression of self. Like I said, when you get someone who you know doesn't like chocolate cake, get them chocolate cake.
It's like from last week's parsha.
Last week's parsha. What was last week's parsha? Huh? Nadav and Avihu. Good example. Yeah, you had last week's Torah portion. We had Nadav and Avihu. They brought an unauthorized sacrifice to God. God told them, "I want you to bring this and this and this and this and this." And they brought something else. God wasn't happy, and they lost their lives. You don't enter the Holy of Holies with the wrong sacrifice. So, if our desire, in other words, there could be all different motivations for doing a mitzvah, but if our desire is to connect to God, this is really what it boils down to. How do we define the godly soul? The godly soul wants to connect to God. If we define the godly soul as wanting to connect to God, then the only way is by following what God tells us to do and what God tells us not to do. Anything else outside of that will not be connecting to God. It may be spiritual, it may be feel good, but it's not.
Maybe a good idea.
Maybe a good idea even, maybe wonderful, but it's not what God wants, right? Okay, and therefore, if it's not what he wants, it's not connecting to him. So let's continue reading here. But this is also important, by the way, just so you don't get lost on the Tanya. All of this is to set the stage. Remember, the whole purpose of the Tanya is telling us how do we serve God and how we have to understand ourselves. But we also have to understand what are the actions that ourselves are trying to do. Once we understand our godly soul is a godly soul, now we know that our godly soul wants to connect to God. Now we know, so what are the things that our godly soul wants to do? Awareness is the first key. This is what the Tanya is telling us. It's awareness. So we've given you the awareness. You have a godly soul. What does your godly soul want to do? It wants to connect to God. How are you going to connect to God? There's only one way. It's going to be mitzvahs. So he says like this. Classically, mitzvahs are perceived as instructions or commandments given by God to man. Observing them is an expression of obedience to a higher authority, right? So we generally think God says, I want you to do this, and we do it, and we listen. But in the language of the Zohar, Kabbalistic book, mitzvahs are perceived as organs of God, something into which his actual being is projected. This is why Hasidic thought stresses that mitzvah is best translated as connection from the Aramaic root savsa. In other words, if you say a mitzvah is an organ of God, when you do a mitzvah, you are connecting with God himself. I don't know if there's a way to describe an imagery of that. Of course, God doesn't have a physical body, but the idea is when you do a mitzvah, you're connecting with God himself. A mitzvah is a connection ritual, a sacred technology that brings you into an intimate bond with God. Of course, you are always connected to God. He created you. He keeps you alive. You see his wonders every day in nature, in human kindness, and in the small miracles of life. But a mitzvah is an intimate connection, rather like a hug or a kiss. When you connect intimately with someone, all your layers fall away as the essence meets essence. If I were to describe it, I would also say it's more revealed. Your connection to God is revealed. Although you're always connected, now that connection is revealed, right? Okay. Think of spouses. Even if they love each other, there are moments when their love is revealed. The connection is revealed. So your connection to God is in a state of revelation when you do a mitzvah. The later chapters in the Tanya, chapters 36 and on, discuss more at length. Again, we're giving you the kernels of the idea here because we really have to describe to you your soul. All this is really a discussion about the soul. It's kind of off tangent, but it's important because we're discussing the garments and the faculties and what your godly soul wants to do. We have to tell you for a moment, at least quickly, what is it that your soul wants to do? It wants to do a mitzvah. When you do a mitzvah, you embrace and kiss God, so to speak. The mystics even compared a mitzvah to the intimacy of a husband and a wife. For a moment, you transcend all the trappings of your life and are one with God. A mitzvah may be a ritual and rules in form, but it is love in substance. So imagine if we were to change our view of a mitzvah. Think about it like this. When you eat that crunchy matzah on Passover, think about that you are connecting to God. It is a ritual, and it's sometimes hard, but think about it. At that moment, you are able to have a revealed, intimate bond with God. Now, just like in marriage, this is what I'm going to keep going back to. In marriage, you will sometimes do things. Maybe it's washing the dishes. Washing the dishes can be an intimate bonding moment, right? Someone brought up washing dishes earlier. It can be, right? If it's an expression of love, right? Yes? Yeah, it can be. And it depends on your feelings at that moment. But if you're washing the dishes and you're feeling anger in your soul, so although you're technically, this can go back to a mitzvah too, although you're technically, right, so you're upset that you're washing dishes, but you are washing the dishes. So you can technically be connecting to your spouse, but I'd say the body is there, the soul is missing, right? So it's kind of lifeless, and we'll discuss that in mitzvahs as well. So you could be eating the matzah and hating it and feeling like you hate doing this. So the body of the mitzvah is there, the soul is not there, and the revealed connection to God will be a little bit lacking in such a mitzvah. So if you do a mitzvah without the kavanah, without the feeling, the revelation of that connection that the mitzvah should bring you will be lacking. Yes, Nicole.
So if you do something with a feeling of love for God, but I mean, is literally washing the dishes a mitzvah? It is not.
We'll get to washing dishes. I was making an example.
It's not about dishes. It's more about
Yeah.
It's not about,
day-to-day actions.
it has to be one of those 613 things. It can be things outside of the 613, and you can still connect with God.
Yes, you can connect to God, things outside of the 613, and we will discuss those a little bit later. But we're going with the obvious first. Tanya has to build it up.
Perfect.
Go with the obvious. Yeah.
Thank you.
The same thing with davening though, because
you
say you're davening the same thing every single day.
Yeah, you daven the same thing every day. So some days you might have feeling in it, some days you don't.
Right. So the challenge is to create the feeling of connection.
Yeah.
Every time you're davening.
I can actually, now that I've been giving these examples, we can actually describe doing the action of the mitzvah with 3 different types of feelings. One is you're doing the mitzvah with a negative feeling at that moment. So let's say you're praying because societal pressure, you have to pray, but you hate prayer. You're like anti-prayer. You're just praying because people want you to pray. Okay, that's one level of prayer. Then there's mindless prayer. So it's not a negative thought, but it's not a positive thought. And then there's prayer with positive feelings and connections. The Tanya, again, later chapters will discuss these 3 levels and how it affects the mitzvah. The 3, if you want to say types of kavana, one is no kavana, one is positive kavana, and one is negative kavana. And they do make a difference. But again, we this section of the Tanya, we're still concise. Okay, because we're really trying to describe the soul mostly, and we have to describe mitzvahs to describe the soul. To say somebody in the class or no? Okay. So now we continue. Reverence, on the other hand, is the motivator behind refraining. Okay, so we've discussed love. Love is, remember I started off saying how love can be the motivation to do positive action, emotions, positive. Someone asked earlier, do all emotions bring action? And I said, some emotions bring positive actions, some emotions bring negative actions. Even if not right away, by the way, just saying. Okay, let's say you love God, but if right now there's no mitzvah to do, then, you'll have to wait, but ultimately will bring an action. Okay, so he says like this. Reverence, on the other hand, is the motivator behind refraining from 365 prohibitions of the Torah. While it is love that motivates you to do something for your beloved, to observe the 248 commandments, it is the feeling of reverence that causes you to refrain from activities despised by him, the 365 prohibitions of the Torah. So he's going to now define reverence. What is reverence? because you revere him to the extent that you will not rebel against the Supreme King of Kings, the Blessed Holy One. So what type of reverence is that? We had discussions of reverence earlier. Notice how he doesn't say reverence means you are afraid to rebel against God because he's going to punish you. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say that because, as I said earlier, that's not reverence of God. That's reverence of the punishment, not reverence of God himself. There are many streams of Jewish ethics which discuss punishment and reward. You will notice Hasidic philosophy, and the Tanya's Hasidic philosophy does not discuss that as much. It will discuss the greatness of God, because again, if you're doing the mitzvah because of the love of the reward, or you're refraining from sin because of the fear of the punishment, then it's not serving God, it's serving yourself. Therefore, the lowest base level that the Tanya discusses, or Hasidic philosophy typically discusses, is reverence of God himself, or love of God himself, not of what he's going to do to you. Because once you get into what he's going to do to you, then it's a fear of the punishment. Now, understanding what God can do to you can help you appreciate the greatness of God. That would be a different discussion. But saying I'm going to not do this thing because I'm afraid of the punishment, not saying fear of punishment you should never be utilized, okay? But remember, that's like bottom of the bottom level. Okay, we don't wanna, that's not our goal. It's like kids, sometimes you need to do that. We don't want to be there. We want to be at a higher place. Okay, so he says again, reverence means you revere to rebel against God. And notice how he doesn't say you're afraid to rebel against God because of what he's going to do to you. So he says like this: at this basic level, you do not appreciate why violating a prohibition will distance you from God. You are simply aware of the result, that it will be considered an act of disobedience against him, and that is undesirable to you. All right, so again, you appreciate God very much. You revere him, and you don't want to do any act of disobedience. Nothing to do with punishment. Then he continues, or it may be a deeper reverence in this, where the very prohibited act in and of itself is painful to you, since you feel shamed in the presence of God's greatness to insult his honor by doing what is evil in his eyes, all those disgusting things that which God's hate. This deeper level of reverence, you appreciate why God hates the biblically prohibited activities. So you now have an appreciation. I'd say, we say kavana, right? You can have intention when you do a mitzvah. Base level intention means I want to connect to God. I don't want to be far from God. A deeper connection is I understand how this mitzvah will connect me with God, or I understand how this mitzvah will distance me from God. And he explains, I'm going to look at the chat in a moment. He says, why are they distancing you from God? Because they are the energy of all the negative forces of the universe, the klipos and setrachra, withdraw their lifeless from mortal man's transgressions, and their holding them through the 365 prohibitions. So you recoil from many of these 365 activities out of the awareness of how damaging they are to the universe. So that's just one example. Again, so it's just one example of understanding, which we're not going to delve into that right now. But again, kavana, there's called general intention for a mitzvah, and there's specific intention for a mitzvah. So general is basically, all right, this mitzvah is going to connect me to God. It's just going to distance me from God. Or I feel and see how this mitzvah particularly is connecting me with God in a very specific way. Or I feel how this mitzvah is damaging myself or the world around me or the relationship with God. And so the more specific you get, the more specific the kavanah is.
I think he has that with like a foot, because you can't really understand it. So how do you?
That's why he gave an example. That's why I think he gave an example here of that. At the very least, understanding the spiritual damage you're doing in the world and to yourself. In other words,
you understand it. You understand that you were told to do it. You're either doing it or not doing it. But
well, let's go with kosher.
The faculty to actually,
right?
Really understand.
But if you feel, but if when you do a sin, in other words, you can know that you're distancing yourself from God, or you can feel how that would be distancing you from God. I think that's the difference. You're right.
But that's as far as you could get, really.
It was certain mitzvahs, yeah.
Because you just don't have the intellectual capability
to fully understand it. With the Kabbalists, with Hasidic philosophy and Kabbalah, you could get a little further, because although there's no human reason per se. The Kabbalists will explain to you the spiritual pathways and how this specific sin is doing specific damage. So then you can get more detailed, yes. But the kavana at the pshat level, at the base level, you can get as far as knowing that you're doing damage to your relationship to yourself and to the world. When they talk about the great mystics and the kavanas that they would have before they would do a mitzvah, that's why they really felt this, they knew all the spiritual pathways in the world, and they could really feel how a mitzvah is creating certain pathways and how a certain sin, damages certain pathways. We can get some inkling of that, but not entirely. Good to see you, Rick. All right, so we're going to stop here with the inside, and there's a couple discussions I want to get, because what we basically discussed is that the godly soul, before I get someone asks, is reverence loving God? Reverence can probably lead to awe, to love of God as well, but it's also fear of awe, feeling of awe. It can lead to love, but it's also.
We pray on Saturday morning that to fear God as well. So, so
that's going to be our discussion now. We're going to discuss now
translation of
love.
fear.
We're going to discuss now love and fear. And again, fear, you want to use the word reverence, you want to use the word awe.
Right.
Translations are hard, especially today where words mean almost nothing. Without elaborating, it's hard to really, words are used in so many different funny ways today.
Yeah.
And none of us are some of us may be wordsmiths over here, but that's why, you can read books all the time. This word doesn't mean this, really means that.
It's not the same as
Whatever.
fire.
So discussing love and awe, he discusses that you need to have both love and awe in your repertoire. In other words, like this, you can have a person, it's possible, that loves God and doesn't really have much reverence. Meet a lot of people like that. They love God, they love the mitzvahs, they love this. It's the do nots that they have trouble with, right?
Yeah.
The do nots, it gives them a lot more trouble. We need to have both energies in our life. We need to have both the love and the reverence in our life. Let's start with love. Love energizes our commandments. If I just did the mitzvahs out of fear, it would be a very dry relationship. Love animates our relationship with God. I love God. I want to connect with him. I want to do this mitzvah. I want to eat that matzah. I mean, you can eat the matzah out of reverence as well. You can eat the matzah with the basis of saying, I don't want to anger God, right? I know he wants me to eat matzah. I'm gonna eat his matzah. Or let's move the word anger. I don't want to disappoint God. But that's not going to be an exciting eating the matzah, right? So if we want to have energy in our mitzvahs, we need to work on our love of God. So this is step number one that I want to discuss, okay? Why is it important to have love of God? To energize the mitzvahs we do. Will we feel the love all the time? No. But the more often we can feel love of God, the more exciting our fulfillment of the mitzvahs are going to be. We never want to feel like a slave. On the other hand, if we don't have the reverence, we may not be careful about the details, let's say. Let me give an example, okay? On Passover, I weigh my matzah, okay? You may find this weird. There's a minimum amount one is supposed to try and eat their matzah, right? On Passover. There are a lot of details to the mitzvah. You got to lean, you should eat it plain, there's got to be a certain amount, which by the way, Adler for all the people. And so someone may have love of God with not so much reverence, let's say, or fear. And so they may say, well, what difference does it make? I love God. I'm going to eat the matzah. Well, who cares? I need a lean. I don't need a lean. I want to connect to God. The reverence helps keep the detail of the mitzvah in check. So what I'm trying to say is that even positive commandments can use an element of reverence in them to keep you honest to the details of the commandment. Because otherwise, love run amok can run amok. You can lose sight of, or let's say, I don't know, you can, maybe a robber loves God, I'll steal money to give charity. I don't know, whatever, there's all different ways. We need to have the reverence always to temper what we're doing. Love alone can be very dangerous. Okay, that's on the one side. And think about it in our own personal lives. This is where I want to personalize it. When we do a mitzvah, do we only do the details that we like? Or do we do it all? I was listening to discussion between different synagogue people recently, and it's interesting. A lot of people really feel like they only want to do the mitzvahs they appreciate and they like. And I understand that feeling, understand where it's coming from, but that typically means there's a lack of reverence. We have to do things even when we don't like it. We pray every day when we feel it, when we don't feel it. We should ideally feel the prayer every day, but we should do it even when we don't feel it, out of at least reverence. This is why even positive commandments that Tanya will explain in other places require, at the very least, some reverence as well. Okay? Reverence is required both in the negative and the positive. Okay? In an ideal world where you're always, quote unquote, on, you're always feeling the love towards God, you probably don't need much reverence. But the reality is, for most of us, we need love and reverence in our lives. We need both in our lives. You have about Abraham. I'll give you a good example about Abraham. Abraham was tested by God many times. His final test was the offering his son as a sacrifice. After he brought his son up and almost sacrificed him, God told him a line like this: Ata yadaiti, now I know, ki yirei Elokim ata, that you fear God, or have reverence or awe. Now, Abraham, come on, he's been serving God for so long. Now, at the age of 100, and what was he, 128 or whatever he was, I think Isaac was 28 at the body, so we put him at 128. 37, okay, at 137, at the age of 137, if Yitzchak was 37, Abraham would be 137 because he was born at 100. So what's going on? Suddenly now, only at 137 years of age, he's been serving God since the age 3, or at least 48 or 40, according to some opinions. Only now he fears God, but God says, no, now I know your reverence is complete. In other words, loving God can get you to do a lot of things, things that are really, really difficult, and nothing more difficult than offering your son as an offering, which of course God never intended him to do, but was testing him nonetheless. That's the sign of a true Yirei Elokim, a fear and awe of God, a reverence of God. And so reverence of God helps us do the things that are the details that we may not like. I'll give another example. I'll give you another example. There's in the book of the prophets, there's a story. King Saul was supposed to kill out the Amalekites, and kill out all their animals. That was his job. The prophet told him, Torah says, you got to get rid of Amalek, you got to kill all of them and all their animals. So King Saul fights the war. He kills everybody except for the king and the animals. So the prophet comes, and the prophet Samuel comes to the king and says, what's going on here? Well, why is the king, why are the animals alive? So he says, I left the animals alive. I thought I want to bring more sacrifices to God. Why kill them? Makes no sense. Better leave them alive and bring them as offerings and sacrifices to God. And you know what the prophet told him? It's better to listen to God to bring a sacrifice. In other words, that's really what it's about. Reverence is saying you're going to do what God wants, no matter what your feelings are, no matter where your love is telling you to go. King Saul loved God. He wanted to bring more sacrifices. He had to have tempered it with reverence. Reverence was supposed to tell him, you listen to God, regardless of where your feelings take you. No matter how much you love God, you got to do it the way that God is asking you to do it, out of reverence. Because if you don't do it, number one, you're not connecting to God, and number two, you're distancing yourself from God. And King Saul lost the kingship because of that. God told him, that's it. You're no longer the king of the Jewish people. You didn't show reverence. Love, not good enough. You got to show the reverence. So this is all heavy stuff. we have a lifetime to work on it. Okay. Don't get lost here, but we have to know, we always have to have awareness of what the truth is. Okay. Even if we're not there, trust me, I'm not there at the level of love and reverence fully yet. But if we operate our lives with just the love, we're not going to be serving God fully and properly. We're not going to fully connect with him. And the same thing goes the other way around.
It's a practice.
Yep.
That's why it's called practice.
We are at the end of the time. 3 minutes. Someone asked a question, so I wanted to get to that question. Someone asked, someone says that they, some days it's easy to do holy things, some days you have to force yourself, right? And you feel guilty for not having motivation, right? This is what I'm saying. Motivation is not always going to be there. The Tanya will actually later on discuss that we should all try to awaken our motivation. Whether the emotions come or they don't, that's up to God, and God will know that you at least tried to awaken the emotions and the feelings. And that's the very least the Tanya will ask us. So again, the Tanya, it will describe here and later on the importance of emotion in our prayer. It will say, well, what happens when you cannot create emotion? It'll try and troubleshoot why. Then ultimately it'll say, at the very least, you should try and awaken your emotion, whether the emotions happen or not. It's in God's hands. You do your best. All right, there's more to discuss. We're really kind of in the middle of this. I think just to recap what we discussed, we're describing the ultimate rapture and connection of a godly soul. What does a godly soul want? It wants its thought, speech, and action, feelings, and intellect, all bonded and connected with God. And we described today mostly how the emotions, love and awe, connect with God through the positive and negative commandments. That's where we're leaving it at today. Thank you so much. And we shall see you all next week, Tuesday at 12 o'clock.
Yasha Koach, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know it's all heavy stuff, so feel free to follow up, and we will discuss a little further next week. Rick, we'll see you at 2 o'clock.
I'm not ready because I've been on. Yes, I'll see you at 2 o'clock.
Okay. He was about to blame the rabbi. Okay.
That's coming.
Okay. All right. I'll see you at 2. I love the glasses. Okay. See you later.